Hello and welcome to Basins and Beer with ESA Analytics. I'm Blue Spikes. Today I'm going to be talking about the Uinta Basin in Utah, and I'm going to be drinking a IPA from Odell Brewing Company in Fort Collins. I've had several Odell beers so far in this series, so I'm looking forward to trying this one. It is 7% with an IBU of 60, which is about double what I usually drink. I'm more of a Pilsner fan, but I do like some IPAs, so I'm kind of excited to see what this one tastes like. They say it's a traditional IPA, but brewed American style. So let's see what that tastes like. Actually, it is really good. I really do like their beers. They're becoming my favorite. Yeah, it's really good. All right, so let's jump into the analysis here. First thing you want to do is open the map, especially with a basin like the Uinta and the Piceance, where if you're not familiar with it, so zoom in, it's western Colorado, northeastern Utah. This whole region here is the Colorado Plateau, and so the Uinta Piceance is this northern part of it. We're going to focus on the Uinta side, the Utah side. So now that we know where we're going, let's just load that up. So there are over 40,000 wells in this region. It'll load pretty quick. Load that up. So we haven't colored it by anything, so you just get this gray scale color palette. So I generally tell people start with formations, and then if you do something like BOE for your size by, this gives you a nice color distribution, and it sizes the dots so they're easier to see. Open the legend. This gives you, open the sidebar, and it gives you a legend that will describe what the colors represent. So it takes a second to load all that data in. All right, so with the Colorado side included, this is your distribution of formations, but we're going to filter down and go to only Utah, because we were only interested in the Uinta Basin in this episode. So let's give that a second to load. Filtering always takes a couple of seconds, but that was 5 or 6 seconds to get everything loaded. So still pretty quick. This shows, okay, if you're looking at these pink dots, these are all Green River. These blue dots, this is Wasatch. This gives you a sense that, there's a lot of open area in the Uinta Basin that hasn't been drilled. So you start asking what I would ask, why? Why are these areas open? Is it not very economical in those areas? Have they just not figured out how to make it work? Is the acreage not available? These are all questions you'd be asking, because if you were in the Williston, you wouldn't see this kind of open acreage in the middle of the basin. Or if you're in the Permian, everything would look a little more drilled out when you're looking at horizontals and verticals together. So just zoom in a little bit there, give you a sense. The scatter plot shows the default settings with producing length versus BOE. Anyway, this gives you a very good overview of how things are distributed across this basin. All right, so let's look at operators. So geologically speaking, the operators aren't really important, but it's nice to know who your big players are and how the acreage is divided up. So if you're used to looking at, I kind of misclicked there. Let me start over. All right. So if you're used to working in the Mid-Con or the Rocky Mountains, these names will be maybe a little unique to you, like Karis and Scout, Berry, Middle Fork. Those aren't the household names that you might see in the Williston or in the DJ, or especially in places like Texas. But if you scroll down a little bit and get deeper into the list, you can see that the big players, they are present. They do participate in this basin. You have Exxon, Chevron, EOG. They don't dominate it the way they do some of the bigger basins. Or I shouldn't say bigger, I should say more well-developed basins. So anyway, that's your operator distribution. You can see that single operators really dominate specific areas here. This is all pink, this is all purple, this is all kind of this brown color. So, I mean, that's a little bit unique. Normally it looks more like this, where there's sort of intermixed companies working in the same area, sort of fighting for acreage. But in Utah, it's been, it's, I guess, been ignored enough that single companies have been able to take over these huge connected tracts of land. So, I mean, it's just kind of an interesting story that plays out in Utah. One thing I also want to do is to look at direction, and vintage, because this always gives kind of an interesting perspective as far as how things have changed over time. So, obviously, everybody used to drill vertical wells, and then they switched to deviated wells, and then they switched to horizontals. And so in Utah, this is no different. In the late 1800s, there was a tiny amount of activity, and then the early 1900s, still not much activity. But then things really took off in the late 40s. And so when things took off, directional drilling was common, and they knew how to do it, and that's what they applied here. So there's more directional wells than any other type of well, more directional than vertical. And, that's, again, if you compare this to something like the Williston, where there are more horizontal wells than any other type, this just tells you that this was more of a conventional basin for quite a while. And now they're starting to drill these horizontal wells. So you see they come in right here at the very end. And so that's around 2014 is when they started drilling those. So everything in the Uinta is a little bit delayed compared to some of the other basins. And you see these open areas. I mean, all of this starts to tell me that, without even really looking at the economics, probably the Uinta, you need a higher price point in order to be economically feasible. And I think, doing some research, that is in fact the case. To drill in Utah and to make money, you do need a higher price point. And so when price dips lower, you tend to see activity drop off. When price is up, you tend to see activity pick up. And right now, one thing that's kind of cool, we can turn off the dots, and we can turn on this new feature that we have, which is the rig count across the country. And what you see is Utah has about, I think this is 6 wells or 6 rigs in this county. You have 4 rigs in this county, and then you have another rig over here. So they have 11 rigs drilling right now. That's more than Colorado, and that's not the norm. Normally Colorado would have more. Now your biggest states in terms of rigs is going to be Texas, and then New Mexico, and then probably North Dakota. Wyoming has quite a few right now, but this is a surprising amount of activity for Utah, and it's mostly, I think, due to the higher price point. Right now we're at $75 a barrel, and that's good enough to get into Utah drilling. So open up the well spots again, turn off our rig overlay, and let's look at structure. So one thing you always want to do is get a sense of, now that we know what the formations that we're targeting, what does the structure look like? Every basin has sort of a bowl shape to it, but where's the deepest part in this particular basin? And so we'll go to the Wasatch, because I happen to know it's one of the deeper formations, and it's a common target for these verticals. So it should give us a good distribution and show us where the deepest part of the basin is. And sure enough, that's what we get. So this is the Wasatch depth. So each one of these dots is a well, and the color tells us how deep the Wasatch Formation is for that well. And so this gives you a very good sense. Again, I like to do this. In our application, we can grid or we can bin this data to fill in these gaps, but I like to show the actual data distribution, because once you grid it, you sort of lose the sense that you don't have data in this area, so you're interpolating. And I like to show that this is what the sort of interpreted layers, that it's based on these points. And I just like to show that for transparency and to show you how good our distribution of data is overall. But in Utah, as I've pointed out, you have these open areas. And so that's just kind of interesting. Let's go ahead and switch to just horizontals. And now let's color by formation. Again, just so you have a sense of what are they targeting with horizontals. And then the other thing we need to do is turn on our surveys. So this does a really good job of showing out in these areas, you have these pink wells, they're the Green River. These look to me more like test wells because they're widely spaced. It doesn't look like full production. So they were testing these areas to see if horizontal wells would work. Up in these areas, like this one big grouping up here, this is more traditional full-scale development. You have wells coming off of multiple wells coming off of a single pad. Everything's very straight and organized, and so you can tell that this is where the operators have had success, and they've decided this is kind of the best area to drill. Another thing you can do, if you're like me and you kind of wonder, well, why does everything stop? If the deepest part of the basin is up here, why does everything suddenly stop and not continue going to the north? Well, that's because you're butting right up against these mountains. So as you go this way, you get into the really hilly, really difficult acreage quick. Not that it's super mountainous right here, but you're starting to go up into these valleys. I mean, you can see everything's, plus this is farmland, so that's what is controlling sort of where people are drilling in the Uinta Basin, is both where the oil is and who owns the land. And I mean, you do have Indian reservations out here as well, and you also have geography. These mountains, they're very big. This is a huge mountain range right here. So you're not going to keep drilling north like you could do in Texas, like just going off in every direction. So let's move on to what production looks like out here. I usually like to go to oil 1 year, and let's just load that up. And let's switch back to our dots. And let's switch back to our kind of grayscale background. And then at this point, it's probably good to turn our laterals back on just to show the distribution. And then the other thing I always like to do is come in here and normalize it by length. So this is going to tell us oil per foot for each of these wells. And it not only shows that what I was suggesting earlier, that these were test wells, and you can see they haven't continued to drill out here. This looks like it could be an okay pocket, but this is where they were satisfied with the results and decided to go full development. And this is more of an analog for what the reservoir quality is, but based on what other companies are seeing in terms of production, that gives you a sense of what you could expect if you started drilling infill wells in these available areas. What it doesn't tell you is where the cutoffs are. And so we're working on an idea to incorporate a reservoir model into this application, and that would start to help us to delineate where the really good acreage ends and the not so good acreage begins. Your hard cutoffs would tell you, is this pocket really worth exploring? What does it look like over here? Does it connect, or is there a break in the middle? So right now, all we have is results from well production from existing wells. And this is what most applications have anyway. So we're not behind the curve at all. This is what most of these platforms that compete with us, this is what they all have. But we're going to take the next step. It'll take us a little while to implement it. But for now, this does give you what you need to evaluate acreage, to understand what your like if you're a landowner, what your acreage might be worth. This tells you if you own mineral rights in an area, should you be exploring them? This app really does work on a lot of levels for a lot of different people, whether you're an oil and gas professional or a landman or a driller. This application will get you to the answers you need very quickly, very easily, and without a lot of time spent learning how to use it. So with that said, cheers. Until next time.